get started. Can everybody see the screen okay? Do we need to mess with the lights at all?
Fine.
It's okay? Ann and Chris, I'll rely on you. If I start getting too quiet or something, give me a high sign and I'll start shouting again. We're going to talk about a little bit about the background of the Legacy Amendment. Now that we're starting with the third biennium, I'm not going to really concentrate on that a whole lot, but we could talk a little bit about that. Mostly we're going to focus on changes we're making for the biennium in guidelines and categories, and we'll talk about grant proposals and a little bit about the portal. And then, like I said, we'll take some time for questions and answers at the end. The constitutional amendment was passed in 2008, November 2008, and this is, as I said, the third biennium that we've been doing this. We've been given money to preserve Minnesota's history and cultural heritage, and that's what our grants program focuses on. We are one of many programs that's funded under the Clean Water Legacy and Land and Legacy Amendment, and our section is specifically under the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. And we are guided by a Citizen Advisory Committee, the HRAC, or Historic Resources Advisory Committee, and they're the ones who meet for the mid and large size grants that we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, changes for the third biennium. We have a little bit of increase in the funding, about 6%, so not a huge amount, but you know, every little bit makes a difference, so that's great news. Big change for the dollar amounts for the grants is that the threshold for the small grants used to be $7,000, and now it's up to $10,000. So in the small grant or the fast track grants category, you can ask for up to $10,000. And that, of course, would then move the mid-sized grants from $10,001 up to $50,000, and then $50,000, over $50,000 is still the large grants category. We do have some new Historic Resource Advisory Committee members. They cycle off every 2 years, so there are some new faces on that. Of course, we have new deadlines, and then, as I mentioned before, we are revising guidelines, so you'll be seeing those posted online shortly. For the upcoming fiscal year 2014 starts on July 1st, and we have just over $5.5 million for that fiscal year, and then the second fiscal year of the biennium, FY 2015, a little bit more than that. So, you know, roughly $5.5 million per fiscal year just for the grants program. Oh shoot, I didn't change the deadlines. These are actual deadlines now that we have our appropriation, and we know we have the funding. The first small grant deadline will be July 12th. We had originally put out a tentative deadline of June 21st for the first small grant, and we have moved that back now to July 12th. We're setting up a system for the small grants, so we'll have a minimum of 4 small grant deadlines per fiscal year. So July 12th, October 11th, next January 10th, and April 11th, and then depending on what kind of funding we have left, we'll add in some additional deadlines as we need to, and we will post those online. We also have a local history news e-newsletter, which some of you may be subscribed to. That comes out every Wednesday, and we also put in regular updates on the grants program there as well. The mid and large grants, we have 1 grant round per fiscal year for the mid and large, and the mandatory pre-applications will be due August 2nd. These are all Friday deadlines, by the way. August 2nd, 2013, mandatory pre-application. Pretty much you're filling out the full application form in the grants portal and submitting it for the reviewers to look at. Final applications will be due September 27th. That's after you get the feedback from our office, and then you'll have time to revise and get your final application in. And then the HRAC committee meets on November 7th and 8th. And it will be pretty much structured the same way it has been in the last 2 biennia, where we have the the whole thing's an open meeting both days, but the first day will be the presentations from the applicants, and then they'll do their deliberations after that, and then the second day of the meeting. Any questions on deadlines or anything so far? No? Okay, again, the 3 funding tiers, not a huge change, except that the small is now up to $10,000. I did have a question before we started today about procurement, whether you have to still go out for bids, and that doesn't change at all. That's a state requirement, so you do still have to go through procurement, either verbal or written bids, depending on the dollar amount for your project. Completion dates, again, the legislature gave us an extra year to finish up projects. Those of you who have submitted projects and had grants in the first biennium probably remember the last day of the deadline, the budget, the biennium, we were scrambling to get all of our final reports done because they wanted everything to be done June 30th when the money expired, and that was pretty crazy. We were closing about 486 grants by the end of the biennium. So we asked them the next time if we could have a little bit of wiggle room, which they have done. So for the fiscal year 2014, which starts July 1st, 2013, the funding needs to be spent by June 30th of 2015. So you have an extra year there, and historic preservation grants actually have until 2017 to complete projects. And those are pretty much for the construction, right, Catherine? So if you have a construction project that might take a little bit longer, construction seasons can be kind of crazy in Minnesota, so you have a little bit of extra time there. These are the absolute drop-dead dates for spending down the funding. Now, keep in mind that when you get your grant contract from our office, the end date in the grant contract supersedes this. So for the small grants, generally you have a 12-month period to complete the grants, and that'll be listed in the grant agreement. Okay, eligibility, this has not changed. These are the same eligible applicants from the last 2 biennia. We have eligible applicants being 501c3 nonprofits, and it is just that one designation. It's not 501c6 or C4 or any of those other ones. It has to be 501c3. Government units, so townships, cities, counties, tribal organizations, that's any of the 11 recognized tribes in the state of Minnesota. Educational organizations, and then we do have the ability to sponsor non-eligible applicants, actually. So if your organization was I'll pick on Ramsey County Historical Society, if they wanted to sponsor a non-eligible applicant, they could do so with themselves as the applicant and then the sponsor working with them. They have to be more than a fiscal agent. A lot of times people will talk about their fiscal agent that's working with them. That's a really bad word for us because the legislature does not allow fiscal agents in our program. So make sure that if you are partnering or you're sponsoring somebody, that you actually have a vested interest in the project. So you're working together and you each have some kind of work to do with the project before it's completed. Non-eligible applicants, individuals, for-profit corporations, anybody with overdue grants from our office, and you will hear from me if you're overdue, so you will know if you're overdue, because you'll have an email from me. And then all others that you don't see under the eligible application list. A little bit more about the sponsorships. Again, I really want to push the fact that you need to be, you need to have a vested interest, and really both of you have a part in working on the project. So really even a sponsorship might be viewed as more of a partnership in that case then. And never use fiscal agent. We don't want to hear about that. That's pretty much going to raise red flags with the reviewers, and you're going to have to clarify what your relationship really is with that. And for building projects, the property owners have to demonstrate that they have control of the property through a deed or a lease. Okay, some eligible projects. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because we have them broken down into slides coming up, but we do have a number of eligible projects that fall under a number of categories under history and historic preservation. This is pretty much the same. We've added and reorganized a couple of the categories, but in general, we still have the history track and the historic preservation track. And then we also have the structured grants, or the simplified grants that have the, like the one-page application and then a budget page or extra materials you might need to include. And we're actually adding, we're adding to that all the time. So, make sure you keep checking back on the guidelines page and taking a look at what new and improved things we might have out there. Okay. Any questions before I move on to talking about each of the categories?
For the previous slide, I wonder if it's possible, for example, with the historic preservation project where you're working on a national register or local designation, to make use of oral history as a research method. Or would that be crossing box?
You can, but you can't apply in more than one category. So if the end product is going to be the National Register nomination, then you're going to apply on the National Register. And that's fine if you're using,
But it would be
I
fine.
think, Becca, they can use that as part of their research, or?
Yeah, for research, I mean, you could reference an oral history in the context or history of your nomination.
But what if we were going to perform oral history as part of the research process?
It's not something that the Park Service requires, and they don't really have a means to house it. So it's not something that would be able to be submitted with the nomination.
Okay.
Kind of like the books that you use to reference. That's the only capacity that it could really serve, since it's more of a scholarly document. So, I mean, you could use it as a reference to using your history, evolution of the property, what have you, but it's not something that you could actually submit with the nomination.
Exactly, but it could be work that was paid for under the grant, historic preservation grant. No?
No.
Okay. Understood.
Not as the National Register grant. Depending on your timeline, you could apply for a small grant to do the oral histories and then come back and apply for a grant to do the National Register nomination. You'd actually apply for two different grant rounds. That might work, but yeah, to combine that really,
That would be
in that way
considered
would work.
more of a phased project. So that would be 2 phases.
Any other questions? I'm going to run through some of the eligible projects in each of the categories. This is not exhaustive. We just kind of hit the major points for what we've seen coming in as fundable projects. So under collections, care, and management, work with archives, either establishing the archives or developing archives, collections, surveys, inventories, cataloging your collections, storage or rehousing. So if you need new shelving, if you want to look at the collapsible or the compact shelving, collapsibles, that's not good, compact shelving, or purchasing acid-free materials, boxes, tissue to store your materials or artifacts, conservation, treatment, and then infestation control, pest management, integrated pest management, those sorts of things are all covered under this category. Digital conversion and online access, this is one of our categories that's we're still finishing the final edits on, but generally these are the sorts of projects that are covered. Reproduction of digital services. Joey can probably help me out on some of these. Converting.
You're doing great.
Go ahead. I'll just stop talking.
No, you're doing great.
If you can convert some of your old materials to digital, to preserve them. Keep thinking of the history and access and the preservation mindset when you're looking at this category.
The only thing I would say is it's actually going to be splitting into 2 categories: digital conversion and reproduction, and then online access will be its own separate category with interactive technology. And the idea was to separate, because in the past, we had a lot of people wanting to do the digitization of photos and video and put them online, and it was a really complex grant, and a lot of those got declined. So in a sense, we asked people to break it into two phases. Do the digitization first, and then think of the access second.
Okay, public education and interpretive programs. This is our old interpretive programs category, which we've added a public education component to. So exhibits, researching exhibits, implementing them, organized resources, historical markers, tour brochures, developing Minnesota history curriculum. And keep in mind that many times, especially with the small grants, the reviewers are looking at phases. So you're going to be doing a research portion, and then you're going to be doing the implementation, and they'll be looking at splitting that into two different grant projects, basically. If you already have all the research done, you can just come in and do the implementation grant. But if you're planning on starting from scratch, you're going to want to split it into two phases. They want to see that you've left time in between the research portion to then have it reviewed by some knowledgeable authorities before you then go into the implementation phase. Publications and research, that could be gathering information to write a publication. In that case, your final grant project would be a manuscript that the reviewers will be looking at. It also includes publishing. So you can include printing costs. Again, this is another one that's easily broken into two phases, where you do the research and the writing in one, and then you come back for the publication in the second phase. Museum and archives environments, HVAC, so temperature and humidity control, dust control, lighting, security systems, and complying with ADA accessibility. And that would be within the building. We've got some of these projects that are more building related, so you'll see that in the historic preservation track. And this is really working more with interiors in your museum or your archives building. Oral histories. You want to make sure that you have a project that is very specific to your area. So as we say in the office, you don't want to do salvage oral history where you're just interviewing all the old people before they die, which sometimes people want to do, but we need something that's more project-based. So we've actually funded quite a few that have to do with immigration and immigrant experiences, language preservation, local controversies, like when actually back in our state grants program, Norwood Young America did a great oral history on what happened when Norwood and Young America actually combined into one community. So those sorts of things that we're talking about, changes from a rural community to an urban community. But it has to have a little purpose. And when you're applying for this category, make sure you have some ideas of at least topics that you're going to be talking about. If you have a list of questions that you're going to be asking your interviewees, that would be great. If you have a list of the interviewees you want to talk to, even better. So the more information you have for the reviewers, very helpful for them to be able to see what your project is really about. And then a big part of the oral history is the transcription. So not only are you going to do the interviews, but you need to have them transcribed too as part of that project. Okay, heritage tourism. Now we're starting the historic preservation stuff that I'm going to be pointing over at our other staff to help me out with. Heritage tourism plans, this is podcast, correct? Am I right? Tour development, wayfinding, signage for historic districts. Jump in if anybody wants to add anything. Historic properties, this is when you're dealing with a property that is listed in the National Register. Pre-development work can be for a building that's been determined eligible or is already listed in the National Register. But if you're actually looking at construction work, like new roof, window repair, foundation work, anything like that, the building must be listed in the National Register. This category also includes historic structures reports, reuse studies, and preservation. Second slide for historic properties, this actually covers quite a bit of material. Also, we were talking about the accessibility that comes with the museum and archives environments. That also is included here for exterior construction related things such as a ramp, elevator, or accessible restrooms in a National Register listed building. National Register and local designation. We've expanded this category to include local designation. We did always have the National Register nomination category. And that's basically hiring a consultant to write the National Register nomination. Now, keep in mind that the building needs to be already evaluated and determined eligible for the National Register before you get to this point. Okay, this can also include archaeological sites. We're seeing an uptick, I think, in archaeology that we hadn't before, so it's pretty interesting. You'll see on your staff sheet, actually, we've added David Radler as one of our contacts for the archaeology questions. Historic preservation planning, historic context studies, preservation plans, local preservation ordinances, preservation plans for community. And then we have survey, inventory, and evaluation. So phase 1 survey of archaeological sites, surveys of property types, geographic areas, evaluation of previously surveyed historic districts. Do you want to add anything to this? No?
You're doing great.
You can tell I'm really more on the museum side. Archaeological investigations. Previously surveyed historic properties to determine eligibility for listing in the National Register. Okay, moving on to the application process. Do you have questions on the categories before we move into talking about the applications? Okay. This slide is just kind of a simplified version of what we do and what we need for the application. First of all, you're going to develop your project. You're going to identify what your need is. And a lot of times people call us and they say, well, you know, what do we do? What do we need? That's something you want to talk about with your board. If you have a governing board or a governing authority, a lot of times they'll have an idea of what you need for priority. And then kind of start at the top of that list and work your way down. So usually what I say. You know, make sure you have all of this, all of what's in number 1, kind of done beforehand. Read the guidelines, identify what funds you might have available, especially for the mid and large size grants. You really would like to have some kind of match. Cash match is extremely helpful, especially with building projects, but even some in-kind, just to show that you have some community interest and you have people that are backing you up with this project, that there's a reason for doing it, that there's an interest, that there's a need in the community. So keep those sorts of things in mind. Once you have all that pre-development stuff out of the way, then you want to move on to the pre-application process. And really, the pre-application, as I mentioned before, is just for the mid and large grants. The small grants themselves are kind of a pre-application in a way because we run that grant round more often. If you get denied in one, you can come back the next time because you will get feedback from the reviewers in an email, and they'll give you some ideas of, you know, what happened with the grant application, how you can strengthen it for the next round. So that in itself is kind of pre-application. This particular one, we're actually talking about the formal pre-application process that you need to complete for the mid and large grants. So you will get your online access. If you already have a login and password for the grants portal, great. If not, go ahead and ask for one. We kind of do that as it's kind of a hands-on thing yet, so John Fulton in our office will be actually getting your request, looking at it, and assigning you a login and a password. So give him a couple days, don't come in on the morning of the deadline and try to get your, get everything done at once, because that'll be a very long day for everybody. So, but for the pre-application, it's the same process as the final application. So you want to fill out the entire application form, as much information as you have. So, your scope of work form if you're doing a building project, even your 990 if it's a project that's over 25,000. Am I right on that, 25,000? If you have already contacted some people and gotten bids, any of that information, include that with your pre-application. The more complete it is, the more information the reviewers have to take a look at what your project is all about. Otherwise, a lot of that will come back as part of the pre-application review, and you'll have to have it in your final application, but it won't have had that once over already. So number 3 is a pre-application review. I was kind of jumping ahead there. The MHS staff, the grant staff, does the pre-application review for all grants. And then, as I said, the suggestions and the comments will come back in a form of an email. So make sure that you have an email address set up with your login that somebody's actually monitoring. So you'll get that information. We try to get it out a couple weeks in advance so you have some time to revise and make any changes that you want to before the deadline. But it's not going to help if somebody's not checking the email. So make sure it's one that's active. Final application, that's when for sure you need all of the information that we've been requesting, and hopefully our revised guidelines make it much clearer as to what forms and extra information that you need. We'll talk a little bit about that in some slides coming up as well. The review for the final application, again, starts with the staff, and then depending on the dollar amount, it will also perhaps go to peer review. If it's over $100,000 request, it'll go to peer review. And then all mid and large grants go to the HRAC committee for their review. And then they are the ones who ultimately make the recommendation for funding through that November meeting that I mentioned. Once it goes through all the review and we've made our recommendations for awards, the final okay comes from MHS Executive Council or Committee. They have to approve of all grants that come through, and that's not been changed since the beginning of the program. But once we get through all that, then you will get a letter from us with the grant award. And basically we start out with a letter that announces the award, and then shortly after that we start getting the contracts out for you to sign and return. Keep in mind that the grant project really can't start until everything's been signed and returned to our office. With the small grants, you'll get an authorization letter from me that gives you the go-ahead to start the project. The mid and large grants are a contract that actually have the start date listed in it. Okay, and so number 6 is kind of everything else. Once you get the go-ahead to start the project, then you've got your year or 18 months or whatever your grant period is, and at the end of it you'll do the final reporting. In between time, make sure you contact us if you have any questions. If you want to make any changes to your budget or the project, you need to contact us and get the okay from the reviewers. And then the final reporting should be submitted through the portal by the deadline, so you're good to go for the next round. Okay, any questions? Yes?
What's the estimated date though? So the review is in November.
For the mid and large grants? You would probably be looking at starting your project beginning of 2014, January, I would say. Yeah, because if they're meeting in early November, we generally get that to the council within the next few weeks, perhaps December. And we try to turn things around pretty quickly so you can get started. So I would say January, February 2014.
And you also want to, when you're planning your timeline, think about your own timeline, having your board approve any letters of agreement or the contract. You want to make sure that that's kind of worked into your timeline, because sometimes that can delay a project too. So give yourself enough time.
Okay. Any other questions on the process? Yes.
After it goes through this whole process and the committee makes their recommendations, are there many changes that the executive committee makes, or is it usually pretty much a rubber stamp?
They don't usually make changes. We don't want to call it a rubber stamp. They do have the ability to call out grants, but generally they'll take the staff recommendations or the E-track. But we are required to pass it through them, and they receive a docket, so they know who the grantee is, where they're from, what the dollar amount is, what the dollar amount requested. So if they have any questions on what was decided by any of the review members, they certainly have the opportunity to ask about it.
And then the HRAC committee decision is public when they make that decision, or does it have to go through the executive committee's thorough review?
It still goes, every grant goes through the MHS council or committee.
But
Yep.
is it public knowledge which grants are going through, which
From the
recommendations?
HRAC? The meeting itself is an open meeting, and then after that point, we really don't publicize until the council makes their determination. And then after that, we get the press releases out for that. Okay, any other question?
If, for the smaller grants, say you're doing a two-part phased study of something, is it possible to apply for a second grant prior to completion of the first phase or not?
It depends, I guess.
For example, say you have an HSR that you're doing in 2 phases and you've been approved for the first one and you've got that process underway. I guess, yeah, the question was, at what point can we submit for the
The
second
reason it
phase?
depends is that we need to make sure that the entire project can be completed. So if the first portion is still in process, then it becomes difficult to say with a total assurance
Sure.
that it's going to go through.
Yeah.
If you're very close to the end and you're at basically the point of the report, that's a little bit different. But
Okay.
to submit something 1 month or 2 months later before the project
Right.
is really going, you submit another grant, that becomes problematic.
Okay.
And you want to make sure you're truly phasing your project, not just segmenting it. An HSR would be an example, a historic structures report would be an example of something we wouldn't allow to come in as phases, because it really is one project and should be completed as such. So,
Actually improved phase 1 of this HSR.
well,
so-
generally speaking, so if it's, I don't know what project you're referring to, but generally speaking, if it's something that should be able to be completed in one proposal, that should come in under one proposal, and it should not be broken up into phases. It should be completed as one project in its entirety.
Okay.
We're trying to get away where you do not want people to do what we call segmentation, to get around the $10,000 cap, break it into 2 phases, which really are not phases, but all part of one. The grants are for projects, so a project has to have a beginning, middle, and end, and it has to be completed.
Anything else? Okay. We can come back to these two if we think of questions along the way. We'll have time at the end. We're going to talk about some basics for review. What the reviewers are looking at when they're reading the proposal is whether the the grant application is complete, whether you meet all the eligibility requirements, that it's a standalone project with an actual beginning and an end to it, that it supplements and doesn't take the place of traditional funding. That's a really big one, 'cause that is coming directly from the legislature. So, especially when you're looking at staff time, you cannot use grant funds to pay for staff time during the project. If you're adding staff, or if you have part-time staff that you're bringing on to full-time for the length of the grant project, then you can pay that additional amount with grant funds, but you can't pay for staff with grant funds if you already have a place that you're paying for that. If you already have salary set aside for them, basically. You want to make sure that all of your projects follow professional standards, and the new guidelines will have some bullet points for where those professional standards are coming from, so you'll be able to see what we're looking at and refer to that for your application. And then, that it meets all the requirements for the grants, Office of Grants Management, that's who we look to for our projects. Make sure you have a realistic budget, that you're not just pulling budget numbers out of the air. We do look pretty carefully at the budget and what your numbers look like, so the reviewers will question that if it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Make sure it can be completed on time. There is a budget and a work plan area where you want to talk about how long it will take to do the project. You don't necessarily have to talk about dates, but you do want to talk about time frames. So in weeks or months that it'll take you to complete a specific portion, just so we know that you have an idea of how long it'll take you to complete it. And again, for the small grants, try to get that within a 12-month period, because that's pretty much what we look for that category. Make sure you talk about the public benefit and the public access to the project. That's another thing that's coming from the legislature, because we're being paid with taxpayer dollars. That's where the fund's coming from. We have to make sure that the public has access to the projects at any point in the process. So even if there's a manuscript that you're going to end up with, say for a publication project, where's that manuscript going to be housed before you get to the actual publication and distribution of it? You also want to talk about the enduring value. So what good is it doing for the people of Minnesota to have this project completed? And finally, is the project sustainable? So after the grant pays for the project, are you going to be able to keep it up for the coming years? Say if you apply for a security system grant, can you pay for the monitoring of that in coming years? Is there a place in your budget that you can carve out the funding for that? Because one thing we can't do is continue funding that year after year. So once you get that, say, security system grant, you can't come back the next year to pay for another segment of it. That'll be it. So then we'll be looking for you to be able to take care of that under your own funds going forward. Okay, tiebreakers. If there are two projects, this quite often comes up at the end of the biennium or end of the fiscal year when we're maybe looking at running out of funds, and we have to we have to be a little bit careful about where we're putting the money. We're going to look at some additional criteria that isn't necessarily required, but it's like extra credit when you're in school. So definitely you're always going to want to show the capacity to complete the project and the significance of the resource. But the match that we've been talking about throughout the presentation, if you have match, that will bump you up a little bit when the reviewers are looking at it as compared to another project that doesn't have a match. Because again, you're demonstrating that you have some community tie-in and some buy-in with somebody outside of your organization. We also need to look at statewide distribution, so we do need to get the grants out to all 87 counties within the biennium. So we will be looking at how many have we already granted to specific areas. we will look at the number of open grants that you might already have open, and again, that ties into the capacity. So if you're applying for multiple grants, are you also showing us that you have the capacity to complete the grants in that given time frame, the time frame that you've been given for the grant? And also number of previous grant awards, and that really comes in at the end when we're looking at the statewide distribution. If we really need to get the money out to a different part of the state, then that kind of comes into play. Otherwise, we don't really have a set number of grants that we can award a specific organization, but we will really look at capacity and ability. Okay. Project description, and this is getting a little bit more into different questions within the application. When you're talking about your project, describe what you're doing, give an overview of the whole project. So if you're just talking about funding for a small part, still talk about the whole project so the reviewers can get an idea of what the whole thing is about. How are you going to get it done? What do you want to accomplish? What are the goals for the project? And be specific. You'll see when you get into the portal that there is a character limit on each of the boxes. So you should be really detailed and really succinct at the same time. Need and rationale. Why are you doing the project? And here are some pretty general reasons for why our grantees are doing projects. Either people in the area demand it, they need those services. A report came out from a consultant or a plan that states that these are the things that should be prioritized within the organization. Timeliness, so we're looking quite often at anniversaries. You're meeting a standard in your for the organization or for the project. I'm thinking of STEPS here for this, the STEPS project that's put out by the American Association of State and Local History. They look at what are good, better, and best. Am I getting those right, Bobby? For being a historical organization. And then you want to either also look at, are you complementing or are you revising some historical resources that might need a little bit of updating? Work plan and timetable. We talked about a little bit about this, about being specific for how you're getting the work done, and how much time you'll need to complete all these steps. Have you left enough time? Have you done some kind of little pilot project to determine how much time you need? Pilot projects work really well for things like collections projects where you have a specific number that you can look at, try it as a smaller project and then extrapolating that out to the rest of your project. And then also allow time to evaluate the project, because that's one of the questions for the final reporting is, how did the project turn out? And so make sure you do some evaluation and surveys or other ways before you complete the project. We talked about this a little bit already. At the MHS Executive Council or Committee approves all grants. And these are just some kind of rough estimates of how quickly we can get the grants turned around. The small grants we call fast track grants, which, considering that we are dealing with governmental entities and state dollars, 55 days turnaround is actually pretty good. So look at what the deadline is for applications and then go out about 55, 60 days from there, and that's roughly when you'll get the approval or the award notification. Bid large and the external partnership grants about 5 months, and that's for the pre-application deadline. So we're looking at an August pre-application deadline, September final application. HRAC meets in November, and then we were saying that probably January, February you'd be looking at beginning the project. And some of this has to do with some back and forth between us as the grants office and you as the organization, the grantee. So when we send out the grant contracts or agreements, make sure you get them signed and returned to us in a timely manner, and then so we can continue our process on our end. And that kind of goes back to, make sure you have a valid email address for your login on the grants portal. Make sure you also have a valid mailing address for receiving the grant applications. There have been several times where I've gotten emails from people and they're like, well, what happened to the grant? Did we get it or did we not? And I'll say, yeah, I mailed it out on this date. And 2 months later, they're like, well, what happened to it? Well, it turns out it goes to a P.O. box that nobody really looks at in the off season. Or it goes to an old P.O. box that they're not using anymore. Or it goes to somebody's house who winters in Florida. We've run into all these kinds of situations. So really make sure that the person that's supposed to be picking up the mail is going to be around and available to get the application. It sounds funny, but it's all happened. Okay. Project personnel. Talk about who's going to work on the project. Name names if you have them all set, or at least give some examples of what the qualifications will be for the people you're looking for. If you're bringing staff into this, talk about whether it's regular staff or project staff, if they're full-time or part-time, and that goes back again to the supplement versus supplant issue, where we can't take the place of regular funding for regular staff positions. So if you're not specific about it, that's one thing that we've really been trained in the grants office to look at, and that'll be a red flag if it's not really well spelled out. Are you bringing on volunteers? Are you hiring consultants? Those are all good things to put in the project personnel section. And then again, qualifications, or if you're hiring, how are you going to find these people? How are you recruiting? If you have somebody in mind, how did you decide on them? What are their qualifications? But make sure you go through procurement and get at least 3 bids if you can, and so you have a pool of applicants to choose from. Evaluation. Tell us how you will be able to know if your project is successful. Did you complete it? Did you reach the goals, or at least some of the goals? Did you accomplish what you had set out to do? And you can talk about quantifications and qualifications. So numbers, how many collections objects did you catalog, or how many people came to the program or saw the exhibit. But you can also talk about what did people learn from your project as well. And kind of talked about this already, counting widgets, what are the numbers for your catalog, your inventory, how many oral history interviews did you conduct, how many people came to the program, does it meet standards? And then, how many people came to your program or your exhibit or bought the book, and then as opposed to how many people actually learned something. What's the takeaway from that project? During value and sustainability, also questions on the grants application. What's the legacy? Of course, it's the legacy amendment, so we're looking at what's the legacy for the state of Minnesota, what is the good for the people of Minnesota, what's going to bring them to see your project or find it online, where will it be housed so they can find it in years to come, and then sustainability, how are you going to keep this up going forward, and that's kind of dependent on the type of project too. So are there continued staffing needs, are there continued needs for paying for controlling something, or monitoring, that sort of thing. If you're doing a website, are there maintenance contracts or yearly fees associated with the website? Okay. Budget. The budget is a table within the application, so you're going to be clicking on a little green button that will allow you to add line by line all of your budget items. You want to be fairly specific, so if you have one line item that says supplies, we're going to come back and ask you to explain what those supplies are. If you have one line just for personnel, be a little more specific. Is it a consultant? Is it project staff? Who is it going to be? And then there's also a section underneath that budget table that allows you to describe where you're coming up with the numbers. So if you received your 3 bids, you can put that in that section, so we know that, okay, they already did the procurement, so we don't have to worry about that. Fundraising and match, again, we're coming back to the match that is optional, but helpful. So again, not required at any level, but you know, it does show that there is some additional commitment in the community for the project. Can be a tiebreaker in, you know, a tight grants round. You can include your time, you can include staff time, volunteer time. If you include time for staff or volunteers, you have to track it. And there is a timesheet that you can use from us. If you want to track it in your own Excel spreadsheet, that's fine too, but we need to see it with the final report when you submit those materials. So any match that you claim, you have to document. Additional information, phases and segmentation, we've kind of talked about already. Catherine did a pretty good job of explaining the differences between what's a phase and what's a segmented project. And in order to avoid getting your grant revoked, make sure you get back to us in a timely manner so we can keep things going between us. And for the large projects, they are assigned what we call milestones, and your project will actually be, the payments will be tied to these milestones. So you'll get a certain amount at the beginning of the project, and then when you hit the milestones, you'll get additional payments throughout the life of the project. So make sure that when you read your grant contract and sign off on it, that you know what those things are. And they're generally tied to work that's done, not necessarily a time frame. So you might have to submit drawings or you know, throw some other site visits. It's another one for the large grants.
Peer reviews.
So it'll all be spelled out. And the large grants, especially when you're looking at more than $50,000 award, you'll be working with the grants office to set up what those milestones are. So there'll be an agreement at the front end between your organization and our office as to which those milestones will be.
The milestones are one way that we track that projects are proceeding as planned. We don't want to get to the end of the grant project. We will not get to the end of the grant project and discover, oh, you're 8 months behind schedule, or certain things that were supposed to be done haven't been accomplished. So it's a way for us to track, to make sure that things are on schedule.
Okay, required attachments. If you are applying for a grant that's over $25,000 and you are a non-governmental entity, so you're 501c3, for example, we need a copy of a 990 or 990EZ, an audit or a year-end financial report, and it should be within a year or so, a couple of years. So basically the most recent information you have. We cannot accept the 990N, a budget, a bank statement, or a balance sheet, because those are all snapshots of what's actually happening right now. We need to take a look at an overall picture. Those are required. So if you get to your final application for the mid and large grants, or mid or large, actually, and you do not have that, that will throw out your grant application. So make sure you have attached that. Make sure you read the guidelines. There are certain category-specific requirements. For example, historic properties, if you're doing construction work, you need to submit a scope of work form and photographs. Digitization includes metadata samples. Oral histories require a list of questions, interviewer questions, or at least a list of topics. So those will all be listed in the categories in the guidelines. Okay, some general tips that we have here. And we've kind of talked about some of this already. Make sure that you have a project that has a beginning and an end. So you have, and then you have an actual product that's visible at the end of it. So we have something to show our auditors when they come and ask us about these various projects. Remember that it's a competitive grant program. So again, you want to be very descriptive about the project, and keep in mind that all of us or the ATRAC members may not be terribly familiar with your organization, so be very descriptive. It's kind of hard sometimes when you are working for the organization and then you're writing the grant, and you're so used to it, it's easy to not really explain yourself very well. Make sure that you're descriptive, and maybe have somebody else read your grant application before you submit it, so it all makes sense.
We described at the beginning the expertise of various staff, so when something comes in for review, it gets sent to the person who has expertise in that area. However, that's not the case with the Historic Resource Advisory Committee, the HRAC, who reviews and makes recommendations. HRAC members read every grant, every mid and large-sized grant that's submitted, and they are not experts in all areas. And they will be commenting and making recommendations on your application. So your description, while it needs to be succinct, it needs to describe in enough detail what's going to happen, the reason for the project, and how it's going to get done, so that somebody who is not an expert in that area can understand that.
Okay. A couple last things. We cannot pay for indirect costs, so everything has to be a direct cost. We can't pay for overhead. We can't pay for operating costs. So it all has to be project related. And then also, don't hire consultants or sign contracts, make any purchases, or basically start your grant project before you get your authorization, because the grant cannot pay for anything that's approved prior to that start date. Okay, we're going to walk through the grants portal really briefly. Some of you I know have applied before, so you're familiar with our portal, and it really hasn't changed a whole lot, I guess, for the application itself since we started. So, but I do want to talk a little bit about what the screens look like and just walk through things really quickly. On the right side there, if you're new to the grants portal and you don't have a login, you can click on Create an Account Now, and that will bring you to a short form. It's almost like a little, really mini version of a grants application, because it will ask you for a dollar amount. It'll ask you for a grant title, just to kind of get an idea that you are asking for a project that is eligible, so we can kind of point you in the right direction. If it seems like it's something that really belongs more with the State Arts Board, we can tell you right then. You won't have to worry about going through the whole application process for our application. Or the time we got a request from Pakistan, we kind of let them know that really the projects have to be Minnesota-based. So, the filling out that form at the front end really helps both of us. Okay, once you've logged in, it'll be an email address and a password that's generated by our office and sent to you. Right now, we don't have a way to reset the password online, so keep your password once it's sent to you. Don't lose it, write it down, or commit it to memory, whatever, so you have it. So this is more about the creating the account, where you have your name, applicant, organization. Make sure you have your organization's FEI number, because we use that to double check the status in GuideStar. That's how we know that 501c3s, for example, are 501c3s. If you already have your login, on the left side of the main screen, the login screen, you can enter your login and password. On your sheet, you have the websites for the grants portal, for the manual, the guidelines, and then our email address for the grants. Grants at mnhs.org goes to a main mailbox that several of us keep track of in the grants office, but you also have contact information for each of us, so if you have content-specific questions, definitely just contact us individually. And then we have a sheet also for all of our contact information, as I just mentioned. And that's the kind of yellow beigey sheet that we have up at the front here. So you have your reference links on one side and all of our contact information on the other. Okay, that is the end of our presentation.